Hello, I'm just seeing if we're all here. Is Maya here? Need Maya? Anna? Here or not? Kesha is here, I see. Arielys is here. Right. And Natalie, are you here? Oh, there you are, yeah. All right, so what we're gonna do is, since there are 5 panelists on this, you have at maximum 12 minutes. So I'll give you a warning at about 5 minutes, just to let you know where you are, 5 minutes left. And then at 3, and then at 1. We're gonna hold off questions for the ending, but I'll ask people to put questions in the chat as they go along if they would like. I'm just gonna wait another minute or 2. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Ann Bomberger. I'm the Director of Honors at Gannon University, and I'm very much looking forward to being the moderator for this esteemed panel. The panel is called Questioning the Borders of Belonging and Environments, and we're going to go in the order of the program. Maya Dinero is going to be doing a presentation integrating biocultural diversity into generating solutions for conservation in Madagascar. LuoCai is going to be presenting on the Chinese diaspora in Peru, dissecting culture and self-identity. Kesha Patel will be speaking on climate chaos. Arielys Liriano will be talking about global refugee crisis and system reform, national response comparison of the United States and Germany. And Natalie Steinbeiser will be addressing the controversial intentions of foreign direct investment and its effects on SDGs in SSA. So thank you very much. Let's go ahead and start out with Maya. Is she here? Uh-oh. I guess she is not here. Is Anna here? Oh no.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, I'm here.
You are here. Oh, great. Thanks. So Anna, why don't you go first, and since Maya's not here.
Okay, sure. Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. I hope everyone can see my screen. Okay, I'll start. So, hi everyone. My name is LuoCai. I'm a senior at the City College of New York, where I study political science and public policy. And my presentation is titled "The Chinese Diaspora in Peru: Dissecting Culture and Self-Identity." So why this topic, right? So I am a Peruvian-born Chinese individual who immigrated from Peru to New York City when I was 3. Because I left Peru at such a young age, I never got the chance to fully understand and engage in Chinese Peruvian culture. So my motivations for pursuing this particular topic for my project is to somewhat fulfill this cultural and identity gap through a bit of self-exploration, research, and reflection. I also wanted to bring more attention to the fact that there is a long-standing history and significant Chinese presence in a Latin American country like Peru amidst a larger global Chinese diaspora. Ultimately, this project of mine really serves as a self-exploration piece and a journey I hope you are willing to come along for the ride. So my argument / thesis statement is as follows. In Peru, the Chinese's utilization of cultural fusion as a survival tactic against xenophobia was necessary for the development and growth of Chinese Peruvian culture and identity to this day. While this might not entirely make sense right now, the pieces will come together as I continue throughout my presentation and provide more context. So just for a little bit of a breakdown of how I structured this presentation, There are three core components, the first being history, second being food, community, and family, and third being identity. So, history starts with the coolie trade. The existence of Chinese Peruvians goes back to the mid-19th century and even earlier, when the Chinese arrived in Peru to address labor shortages following the abolition of slavery. Most of the Chinese immigrated from southern China, including places like Macau and Guangdong. Chinese laborers came to be dubbed as coolies in time, which was derived from the Chinese phrase for bitter labor. The coolie trade between Peru and China was part of a larger coolie trade happening globally at the time, with over 1.5 million Chinese men sent overseas in what became a systematic method of sourcing contract workers from Asia. At least 80% of the Chinese sent to Peru ended up working in sugar plantations, while others mined guano, which is bird excrement, built railroads, and worked on cotton plantations. Despite slavery being outlawed in Peru, the treatment of the Chinese laborers largely resembled the treatment of those who would be enslaved, with the weak silver lining of compensation. The brutal treatment of the coolies reflected the attitudes and sentiments Peruvians held towards the Chinese, which were largely rooted in xenophobia and the racialization of the Chinese as racially inferior to the Peruvians. Of course, the Chinese laborers did not sit idly by whilst they were being treated as second-class citizens, valued solely for their labor, and even then they were still seen as dispensable. There were staged rebellions and concerted resistance efforts, many of which were violent, but there was never really a single collective mass uprising to thwart the whole plantation and labor system in Peru. And in 1874, the Tianjin Treaty of Friendship and Commerce is what officially put an end to the coolie trade, but the attitudes and overall treatment towards the Chinese in Peru remained largely the same. So following the end of the coolie trade, the labor contracts of the coolies were expiring. And while some agreed to renew their contracts, others wanted to leave the backbreaking labor and poor compensation behind. And so many opted to migrate internally to urban cities such as Lima, which is the capital, to pursue better opportunities. Simultaneously, the racialization of the Chinese highlighted how important it was for them to break out of the confines and stereotypes and tropes that the Peruvians had labeled them with. So I opted to analyze three main avenues the Chinese took in pursuing both socioeconomic mobility and combating xenophobia, all under the umbrella of cultural fusion. My analysis is not so much grounded in formal theories, but it comes from taking notes from my own personal experiences and the historical experiences of others, and seeking to identify patterns and commonalities between both, which resulted in food, community, and family as the three main components. So, opening restaurants, or fondas as they were called, became a safe bet for the Chinese who moved to the cities seeking to sustain themselves, whilst also being able to cook dishes that practice Chinese culinary traditions. These fondas largely cooked chifa cuisine, which is Chinese Peruvian fusion food. And it definitely exemplifies the cultural fusion between the Chinese and the Peruvians. As we probably know, food is one of the biggest markers of culture. And chifa is definitely an integral part of the development and sustained existence of Chinese Peruvian culture. Additionally, fondas and chifa cuisine provided meals to all Peruvians, especially the working class and the poor. So through food, solidarity building across racial and socioeconomic lines between the Chinese and Peruvians was able to occur and improve relations slowly but surely. These fondas were largely centered around Calle Capon, in what would eventually be known officially as Barrio Chino, which was essentially the Chinatown. Aside from the food and restaurant industry, the Chinese also looked within their own communities to preserve their ties to Chinese culture and identity. There were societies, associations, sites of worship, and congregation that became highly important for them in order to not completely cut ties with their heritage. And lastly, for this section, families were also a really big part of the continued persistence of the Chinese in Peru. But to put it more bluntly, it was interracial relationships between the Chinese and Peruvians that also contributed to the growth of the Chinese Peruvian population. When the Chinese first arrived in Peru, it was virtually all men, and it remained that way for years to come. While the Chinese were treated as second-class citizens for decades, they were still able to marry Peruvian women, as Peru did not forbid interracial marriages. These Chinese men, in order to establish a continued Chinese presence and grow families in Peru, sought to marry Peruvian women with the intention to produce children with Chinese heritage, even if they were mixed. I definitely recognize that in many ways, these relationships and like this way of family building is definitely very transactional and more so served as a means to an end. But I thought it was still important to highlight the like less flashy and more grim aspects of the factors behind the Chinese's continued presence in Peru. And finally, onto my very last section, we come to identity. You know, taking all the history that I've talked about into consideration, what does it mean to identify as Chinese Peruvian? And what does it mean to hold on to this intercultural identity, recognizing that Peru has a history of anti-Chinese sentiment, and also recognizing how the Chinese historically were able to survive in the face of rampant xenophobia for decades. So in essence, how does the past play into the present? You know, when it comes to things like identity, it is ever in flux, constantly changing and growing. And how I wanted to showcase this continual change is by incorporating my own personal photos from my time in Peru and comparing and contrasting them with historical photos or more modern photos. This endeavor definitely helped me to better understand, in a way, my place in Peruvian society, or the space I once took up, and how much history is actually behind it. So these two photos in particular, I feel really exemplifies the contrast in the specific historical context and development of a Chinese Peruvian enclave, in particular Barrio Chino, which I mentioned earlier before. And I thought these two photos were especially really cool to include because it's essentially the same angle of the photo, and the composition of both photos are so similar. And it was out of sheer coincidence that I came across the image on the left from 1971 that mirrors the one on the right, which is of my grandmother in 2002. So while time has passed, the slide before, the slide, and the next also show how little has changed as well. I am miles away from my birthplace and 2 decades removed from these experiences, which really exemplifies change. But even though I can't physically be there, I can look towards avenues, you know, like the internet and Google Maps to see that there are actually many things that still remain the same. Physical movement to a new home affects how one views their own identity. And for me, knowing that there are familiar parts of Peru that have not changed elicits a sense of comfort for me in a way, much like how the Chinese in the past sought comfort in continuing on their cultural traditions, whether that's through food or other ways. And finally, to close out, I am ending with this photo that I hold very near and dear to my heart. If anything, I think it's the best photo I have that perfectly exemplifies to me what it means to be Chinese Peruvian, and encompasses the themes throughout my whole presentation regarding history, food, community, and family. And it is this photo of my family's chifa restaurant. With chifa in particular, I think of the way my Chinese immigrant parents thought to turn to food to make a living, and how that deeply reflects the pathways many Chinese took to survive decades earlier. The existence of a cuisine like chifa with roots in the 19th century still being present at the turn of the 21st century is a testament to the strength of cultural fusion. My dad, he still cooks lomo saltado for us to this day, and my mom loves to surprise my sister and I with a Peruvian drink called Inca Cola. And every time that happens, I am reminded of what it means to be a part of this very unique Chinese diaspora and Chinese Peruvian culture and identity. I am myself a product of a decades-long persistence and survival in a history etched with rampant xenophobia. And I would not be here, at least not as an individual who holds onto her Chinese Peruvian identity so strongly, if it wasn't for those that came before me and the long and turbulent history in Peru. And just the very, very last note I want to speak on, it does not escape me the direct connections my presentation has with the heightened targeted violence against Asians in this country as of lately. And I feel very compelled to just acknowledge the similarities and bring attention to this through my presentation and platform. The xenophobia and anti-Chinese sentiment in Peru that I speak of in my presentation largely comes from a historical standpoint, but it does not mean that it's obsolete. These Asian attacks in the US are nothing new. Even within American history, there's a long history that goes just as far back as Peru's, if not even further back when it comes to anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment and attacks. the Chinese diaspora is undoubtedly part of a larger Asian diaspora throughout the world. And I just hope that you recognize that wherever you are, whether that's Peru, the US, or elsewhere, that history has continually been edged with xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiments that are maintained to this day. And I hope that you take away that this is not a new issue at all and have learned a bit more about it on a global level. Additionally, I hope that bringing you along for this self-exploration piece of mine managed to leave you with newer perspectives and an understanding of the rich histories and the reach of the Chinese diaspora to areas you may have not known of before. So here are some of my references, and if you would like to contact me or discuss more about my presentation, there's my email. Also just wanted to give a shout out to my professors. I think they're on this Zoom, Professor Reese and Professor McBride. Thank you so much for listening.
Really lovely job, Anna. I love how you connected personal with history, with current politics. It's really beautiful. All right, we're going to be moving on to Kesha Patel's presentation, Climate Chaos. I did learn that
which is of concern. And the projections are grim, right? It's not looking like it's getting better. So Bangladesh is sitting on the Bay of Bengal, and it's a river delta. And there are 3 rivers that go into this delta. And the water levels in the delta in the rivers has increased for a few reasons. So one, the storms from the sea push water into the delta, so that's increasing the water level. Ice and glaciers in the Himalayas are melting, which is putting more water in the rivers and the delta. And then this one isn't as much a natural occurrence, but India's water regulation policy, where they let the water go during monsoon season, but then divert water during dry seasons, has also led to the increase of water in the rivers and the Bay of Bengal. That has led to increased storms, increased flooding, which erodes the land in Bangladesh. And the land, it gets eroded, so they can't grow their crops, they can't grow rice, which was one of their main crops. So because they are losing their means of living, people migrate. And in Bangladesh, the migration is primarily internal. So they're moving from rural areas in Bangladesh to cities in Bangladesh, primarily Dhaka. So Dhaka is one of the cities that people are moving to. But the problem here is that first, there's been a lot of migration into Dhaka. And so they are reaching their limits of how many people they can take in. The other problem is Dhaka is also threatened by climate change, by sea level rising, by floods. And so there's a good chance that the people who have migrated there will be forced to migrate again because of the threat of climate change. And another interesting part about Bangladesh is that they have had migration into Bangladesh from Myanmar. Recently there was a coup, but even before that, the Rohingya people were being persecuted in Myanmar, and so they have fled, and so they are living in refugee camps and in Bangladesh. So that's a little bit about the climate and the migration. Now, as for human trafficking, the United States State Department ranks all countries on different tiers of human trafficking. So it's tier 1, tier 2, tier 2 watch list, and tier 3. And Bangladesh has recently improved from tier 3 to tier 2. That means that they have made some improvements, but there's still things that they can improve on. There's still progress to be made. But that doesn't mean there isn't trafficking. It just means that the government response has been a little bit better. But people are still being trafficked. People are still lured away into trafficking with job opportunities. They're forced into marriage, things like that. And interestingly, the Rohingya people are one of the most trafficked groups in Bangladesh from the refugee camps. Now, in Somalia, it's a little bit different. They have experienced, I think, about a 15% decrease, average decrease in rainfall. They have had a lot of droughts, which has led to famine. There was one in like 2011. In 2016 or 17, there was like a really big flood that eroded the land. So the land that they have used for agriculture has been increasingly eroding, and people are losing a means to live. And as a result, people are moving into cities, away from rural areas. People are moving into refugee camps. And there is also a terrorist group in Somalia that's benefiting from climate change, because people go into this one, they're like recruited or forced into the terrorist group, but they're also, some of them, going by their own free will because of the instability and the lack of making a living in Somalia. So that climate condition has led to migration. And then as for human trafficking, the government in Somalia, like I had said before, is kind of non-existent. There's like one federal government that has control of like one city, the capital city. There's a self-declared independent area, Somaliland, and then that the militant terrorist group has control of part of Somalia. And so there isn't like a robust government response to anything, which makes people even more vulnerable to be trafficked. And so there are more people, and the terrorist group perpetuates trafficking as well. So the conditions in Somalia are a little bit different than Bangladesh, but there is a lot of vulnerability and trafficking because of climate change. So for implications, I think that there is a lot of room for more research. I hope to continue researching this. I think people who are a whole lot smarter than me should also be researching this. Like, I think it adds to the understanding of climate change, implications of migration, and of human trafficking. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Yay. Congratulations. Very nice work on an increasingly important issue. Next we have Arielys Liriano to talk about the global refugee crisis.
Can you all hear me? There we go. All right, so I'll share my screen. Let's see. So thank you, everyone. So today my topic is on the global refugee crisis and system reform, a national comparison of the United States and Germany. And I'll be going over my research methodology and particularly historical analysis of the public policy and through a comparative case chart that I created, and economics of refugee migration and refugee integration, and interview results that I conducted. So this map right here just showcases the top countries of origins from which refugees are coming from all over the world. So we often hear about the Syrian refugee crisis, so that being the #1 place from which refugees are originating from, followed by Venezuela, but it is predicted that Venezuelan refugees will soon surpass Syrians in numbers in terms of the refugees displaced worldwide. So there are hundreds and thousands of individuals who are displaced every year, and the numbers continue rising. And in connection to Kesha's presentation about global climate change and refugees, the UN Refugee Convention doesn't have incorporate the climate refugees part of the definition, but it is something that through expansion of that definition should definitely be included, given that rising sea levels and individuals just being displaced worldwide to reflect the modern issues that we have today. And let me see. Ooh. And in terms of asylum seekers being admitted, Germany has historically not admitted as many individuals that are trying to obtain asylum into the nation, with 2005 having a 6.5% rate of admitting asylum seekers compared to 2015 and 2016, where it was able to really increase the amount of refugees. And particularly that can be attributed to Chancellor Angela Merkel helping pass the 2015 migration law which, unlike the Dublin Convention that in the European Union allows individuals to come in wherever they begin the asylum process, wherever they touch upon whatever land, Germany was allowing other individuals, even if they didn't first arrive to Germany, to begin that process in Germany. And in terms of the numbers of refugees in the United States, we can see that in recent years it has decreased, because back in the 1990s, we did have a lot of individuals coming in, and then it decreased, particularly in 2001 and 2002, which can be attributed to the war on terror in 9/11, where terrorism was a big threat perceived by the Bush administration. So definitely more restrictions in that department. And then 2015 and 2016, it was relatively high compared to recent years. And then definitely in 2017, it decreased given the Trump administration's restrictive policies throughout the administration's period. And in terms of my own research, I was interviewing resettlement providers, and I wanted to interview government agencies, but given perhaps with the pandemic and the work that the agencies were doing, I was unable to do that. So in a future study, it's something I definitely would want to incorporate. But the resettlement providers I interviewed were mainly nonprofit agencies who help with the refugee resettlement process, but also I was able to interview one of the major organizations that helps with the distribution of funds for these nonprofit agencies. And in order to be ethical, I had everyone fill out a IRB form, an IRB approved consent form. And there they were able to know about if they wanted to remain anonymous. And my research was heavily based on a literature review. So I was looking at the sociological, historical perspectives, looking at the laws and the public policies in both Germany and the United States to get a better understanding of how the immigration frameworks have been impacted through a historical lens. And then in terms of the policies in the United States, the 1700s and 1800s were a big part of the immigration framework that we have in the United States, particularly New York and Massachusetts state immigration laws have impacted the overall immigration framework that we have today. So those policies tended to be more restrictive in terms of the individuals that the Americans at the time wanted to admit, but they have in turn gone onto the federal level during the 1800s and then have obviously evolved over the years, but that has still been a big part of the way that the United States handles immigration, where certain individuals are preferred more than others, which you can see in every country. You have different individuals who are preferred, perhaps it's because of their ethnicity or their race or wherever they're coming from. There can be certain stigmas. And in terms of Germany, unlike the modern perspective of Germany being more closed off, they have generally been open to an extent in terms of laborers coming in because they wanted individuals to contribute to the overall economy. And they had different seasonal temporal foreign laborers that were coming in. And the Germany's basic law, which is its constitution, in Article 16.2, they had passed this idea where they promised political asylum to individuals who were fleeing political persecution. But given the perspectives of anti-immigration, the rise of populism over the years, that was later amended, and they no longer directly promise having individuals that are fleeing political prosecution coming into the nation. But compared to other countries that are more open to immigration, they have definitely improved compared to also EU countries, because that's why you think about with Chancellor Angela Merkel, how a lot of individuals are not able to come into the country. But we'll see how that pans out too in the future, because the Chancellor Angela Merkel is no longer going to be in office. So depending on who is elected into office in their election, we'll have to see how refugees and migration are going to be changing. And like I said, in the United States, we definitely have some parallels with migrants and refugees compared to Germany, but we have become more restrictive with things like the travel ban, the zero tolerance policy, and the decreasing of refugee ceilings. And you can see that too with the migrant children being detained at the US-Mexico border. And looking at the situation, we'll have to see how the Biden administration acts, but they have promised to raise the refugee admissions. So we'll have to see how that pans out. And in terms of the economics of refugee migration, I looked at it from both the government and refugee level. So from the government level, looking at the screening and hosting costs, particularly because when nations are considering how many individuals they'll be admitting, they are looking at the expense that the country will have to endure for a set amount of time. So the screening costs, particularly how much time it'll take to interview a refugee and seeing if they are deemed admissible into the nation, hosting costs, so the housing costs, education. So for instance, linguistic training is a big aspect. In the United States, it can be a little bit easier because a lot of individuals learn English, whereas people going to German is not a common language that a lot of individuals know. So that's going to take a lot more time to help individuals learn the language. And also the transfer system costs, because when people are at refugee camps or are at different parts of the refugee resettlement process, that is also a cost to consider when taking people through planes to arrive to a different nation. But overall, I found that with the human capital potential of refugees and having them be more entrepreneur, they can be self-sufficient and in the long term serve to the overall economy, because when individuals are working, they are able to contribute to the overall economy. But a lot of that will have to depend on how good of a system of integration a nation has for these refugees in the long run, because in the short run, it'll be expensive in terms of helping provide these services to refugees. But if we're able to help them better adapt, then they're able to really contribute to the national economy wherever they end up. And in terms of refugee integration, like I said, linguistics is a big aspect of this, because then that'll allow individuals to be their own self-advocates. But also social networks are really important, because when individuals who are refugees have a connection wherever they're going to be living in, they are able to have more of a community and also have the opportunity to potentially learn about different job opportunities that are available, or places that they can find resources that the government can provide them assistance with, and because of that overall communication aspect. So depending on how well individuals are able to integrate, they're able to really contribute to the overall prosperity of the different nations that they go to, because they are coming with their own skills as well. And in terms of my interview results, like I said, I interviewed a lot of resettlement providers, particularly nonprofit agencies. And one of the big things that they mentioned was just having a more concrete post-resettlement plan, because when you look at the United States, after 90 days, individuals are not going to be having the direct service and case management services as they had in the beginning. And after 90 days, individuals are not really well equipped to simply adapt to a foreign culture, perhaps the trauma that they coming in. So just having more of that plan in place and also ongoing case management is really important to help with refugees, but also the collaboration amongst the private, nonprofit, and government sectors is really important, because perhaps what one sector is doing, the other is implementing better. So having more of that communication piece is really important. And also looking at different sponsorship models. So for instance, in Canada, they have a co-sponsorship model where I was told by the individual organization that I interviewed how they have been successful in terms of having community leaders come together and help individuals adapt to the nation that they're moving to. And also private sponsorship could be a great way to help refugees adapt, because the cost is not going to the government. It's more so private institutions and individuals coming together that are contributing to helping with the resettlement process. And just an overall increasing of administrative funds will allow for these nonprofit agencies to be better equipped to help refugees. So in relation to the co-sponsorship model, one of the agencies I interviewed was the International Institute of New England, and they conducted a pilot program in the Massachusetts area, and they were able to be successful in helping the refugee family really adapt and integrate into the area, the new state and the new city that they were in. But the only downside was that their staff was helping the community leaders learn about what the best practices were. And so in turn, they weren't able to assist as many other refugees. So having more funds will allow them to hire an individual who would be working that position full-time and helping other individuals. And in conclusion, there you go. In conclusion, I was considering the security versus safety paradox, whereby a lot of times individuals have a fear of the foreign and of losing that Western identity. In Germany, a lot of the individuals that they historically have admitted have been based on an ethno-nationalist perspective. People who are ethnically German have been more admissible compared to others. So that being able to ensure that citizens don't have that fear of losing the identity when refugees come in is really important. And perhaps that could be done through more community involvement in the refugee system and having people have that direct experience. And also, like I said before, expanding the legal status determination of refugees, whether that's through climate refugees, being included in the definition and in other ways, so that it's more reflective of the modern systems and issues that we have today, and just more cooperation is really needed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Very nice. Now we're on to Natalie Steinbeiser, Gannon University. She's talking about the controversial intentions of foreign direct investment and its effect on SDGs and SSA.
Yes, I am having camera problems though. Is it okay if I just keep it off? I think it will still let me share screen though, so let me try that. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen? Yes, okay. And you guys can hear me, right? Okay. So hi, my name is Natalie Steinbeiser, and I'm a sophomore at Gannon University, where I study international business. Today, I'll be talking briefly about foreign direct investment and the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 in Sub-Saharan Africa and some of the controversies surrounding this financial activity. All right, so just a brief outline of what I'll be covering. I'll just go into background on some basic terminology, what SDG 7 is, and discussing some of the pros and cons of foreign direct investment. So just getting started with some background. So what is SSA? SSA stands for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the area south of the Saharan Desert. This contains 46 of the 54 African countries, and this region of the world faces many issues like poor accessibility to electricity, meaning they have no basic access to clean water or refrigeration and Wi-Fi, weak infrastructure and underinvestment in infrastructure, corrupt governments and officials, as well as political unrest and disputes like we're seeing right now between Ethiopia and the Ethiopian Tigray region. And climate change just at a much higher scale than other parts of the world. So what are the SDGs? The SDGs are short for the Sustainable Development Goals created by the United Nations in 2015. This is made up of 17 different goals, all of which are aimed to be achieved by 2030. These goals address the global challenges that are impeding a better and more sustainable future, as the United Nations calls it, for everyone in the world. Looking at these 17 goals, they reach throughout several different categories, including environmental, social, and economic issues. Within each of these goals, the United Nations has created a specific set of goals for each of the goals to be achieved, as well as a set of indicators in order to be able to track the progress of track the progress on an annual basis. Although these are set to be achieved by 2030, some of the goals don't have a specific end date. It's important to note that all these goals are independent of each other, meaning that if one of these goals are falling behind, then it will have a ripple effect and backtrack the other goals as well. So what is FDI? It stands for foreign direct investment, which is a type of investment made by an individual, but usually a multinational enterprise, in order to establish a long-term interest within a country. There are different branches of FDI, but one that is new and making large strides right now in the world is green FDI, which focuses on investments into projects that are beneficial for the environment. Foreign direct investment has been recognized for its importance in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. However, this practice has also been reprimanded by officials as well. So we did begin to look at 5 different goals, but we decided to narrow it down to just one, which is SDG 7. So SDG 7 focuses on energy infrastructure. This goal is to ensure that everyone has access to affordable and reliable electricity. Along with that, it also wants to ensure that energy is sustainable, which would also increase the share of renewable energy around the globe. Some of the metrics that have been used to measure this includes overall access to electricity, as well as specifically urban and rural access to electricity, access to clean cooking fuels, total consumption in renewable energy, as well as total investment in energy efficient infrastructure. So just some current statistics. This is global stats. So 789 million people worldwide don't have access to reliable electricity. 2.8 million people still rely on polluting cooking fuels. Only 17.5% of power is generated through renewable resources, and energy accounts for 73% of the global green gas emissions, mainly because of the polluting cooking fuels that people rely on. Most of these are occurring specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. For example, 600 million people don't have access to electricity within Sub-Saharan Africa, and that just ripples down to like the basic water, fruit and vegetable refrigeration, and population access to the internet. So the importance of the SDG 7. SDG 7 is foundational for all the other goals, as it helps to intertwine everything that the United Nations is aiming for, like economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability. With that, access to efficient and sustainable energy resources helps to support all sectors of the economy, as reliable access to electricity helps to aid new businesses and entrepreneurs, as well as enhance productivity within these host countries. In looking at FDI, Africa Cleantech is a company that I've been able to work with pretty closely recently. So it's a social enterprise headquartered in Germany, founded by Torsten Schreiber and his wife, Ada. Their original idea was to create an energy plant that ran on garbage burning, but quickly found that no one was really interested in investing in this. This led them to switching to mobile units, creating the first mobile energy production facility in Mali, where Ada is from. As of last year, Africa Cleantech has been able to provide over 100,000 people with electricity from renewable resources in Sub-Saharan Africa. And by 2030, they hope to hit their goal of connecting 3 million people to their grid. They do this through different products like their impact sites, solar tanners, and cool tanners. So the benefits of FDI, after reading some literature on it, it provides economic stimulation for both the host and recipient countries. It provides financing to developing countries, and it modernizes technologies in developing countries. In some disadvantages, there's just less moral attachment from investors, unethical access to local markets, and it can eradicate cultural values and homogenize the world. So conclusion, is FDI fundamentally good or bad? It's kind of hard to say. As I just mentioned, there are benefits and drawbacks to this practice. Foreign direct investment can help to fund projects that support the Sustainable Development Goals. However, FDI can be very unsustainable and even harmful to the host country's culture. Investors in FDI can pull out whenever they want, and this trend has shown in declining number of investments in Sub-Saharan Africa over the course of 2010 to 2018. Looking back at Africa Cleantech and their business type, I think moving our philanthropy towards social impact investing is the way to move forward, as it is much more sustainable. Social entrepreneurship works directly with communities to provide them with energy solutions and hold them accountable by making them pay small amounts of money to stay connected. This teaches the communities how to be productive, responsible, and allows them to preserve their culture as well as improve their quality of life on their own. Thanks for listening.
Yay. Very nice work, Natalie. I really like how these presentations are talking to each other via the environment and shifting populations and the melding of cultures. So let's open it up now to questions. Who has a question for one of our panelists? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I have one.
Okay.
Thank you, Anna. That was such a good presentation, and it was so moving. And it made me wonder if you've shown it to your parents and what they had to say about it, or your grandmother if she's still alive.
My parents don't even know that I've done this.
I think they would love it.
Yeah, actually, no. One of the slides where I have the photo of my grandmother and the photo from the 70s, I actually shared it because I was so mind blown that it was essentially the same angle and like the exact same like spot the photo was taken. Like my mind was blown, and I think I saw that photo at like 1 a.m. in the morning, and like sent our family has a group chat, so I sent it to my grandmother and my mom, and I was like, oh my god, look at this, like this is so cool. But apart from that, yeah, I haven't really shared my presentation with them, but I will.
I would highly encourage it because I also come from a family of immigrants, and it just I don't know, gave me chills listening to it, and I feel like they would really like it.
My question is for Kesha. So I really appreciated your presentation, and I feel like I learned so much from it. But I was wondering, like, is there anything that the US can do to like help fix like the issues of like human trafficking, like, and like how climate change affects that?
So originally when I was doing my research, like the first abstract I wrote, I was like, you know, we should really care more about human trafficking so we can stop migration, we should really care about climate change so we can stop human trafficking. And my thesis mentor was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, he was like, bring it back a little bit. That's a big leap to make. And so I was really hoping, right, like that would be the conclusion I could draw. But after doing a lot of research, I think that obviously we need to combat climate change, right? We need to take steps to reduce our carbon emissions. And that's just important aside from human trafficking for the purpose of climate and for all the other implications of climate change. I think that the United States, it does rank countries, right? So it has these targets and goal and standards that every country should meet for combating human trafficking. And so I think that and then like the UN and Interpol and all of that, all those agencies working together to combat human trafficking is probably the best bet to like in the short term combat human trafficking. But I think that in the long term, we should definitely be considering climate change. We should definitely be taking steps to improve that condition as well. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I did have another question for Kesha. I was wondering, so a lot of the times in the US, I guess, most people, especially I would say in government, sort of tend to think of climate change as, or at least I guess in the past, when people were first raising a lot of concerns, it was more concerned with like nature than human rights as much. But your project really seemed to show that it is a very immediate human rights issue, along with you know, obviously everything else that it affects. It was a very, very direct impact rather than just like food and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I thought of my presentation because I was at a protest about climate change, and that one was the protest was talking about like the impacts of climate change on health.
Oh, yeah.
So like I think that the impacts of climate change on people is very vast and maybe a little underexplored, right? Because I know that like in science, right, we explore how it impacts like coral reefs and
Yeah.
like other populations, like animal populations. But I think that there are also human effects to it. And I mean, I hope that also like maybe energizes people to maybe take it into account more, consider it more, maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
Like just to add off that, like Kesha, like your presentation like really opened my eyes, because I feel like sometimes when I think about climate change, like I think about it just in terms of, oh, it's just affecting the environment, it's just affecting like the physical, like the earth. But then you realize like we are so interconnected with the earth and like other people. So if something small like affects one area, it's going to ripple out and affect every other area. So I would have never thought to connect human trafficking with climate change, but listening to your presentation, I'm like, she is right. This makes so much sense. And I can totally see how this is all connected. So it's just crazy to think about how like one small change can just make a huge difference. And like, so that can be good or bad. Like we can do something really good and it's going to really help the world. But with climate change, it's hurting a lot of different aspects of our lives. And we have to start to see how everything is interconnected just to try to fix it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well.
Thanks.
Natalie, could you connect up some of your research about how climate change fits in with the Sustainable Development Goals, or is that too far afield?
I'm sorry, what was it again?
I was just wondering if you could connect up
I think you're muted, Dr. B.
You're on mute.
I do that. I was just wondering if you could put a bridge between your presentation and Kesha's presentation, because I thought it was an interesting connection about, if you could develop a little bit more about how climate change is impacting Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, and how these Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to help mitigate some of those problems.
Yeah, I mean, climate change, I've read a bunch of reports and it says that in areas that are less polluting, they actually are experiencing climate change at a much higher degree, which I thought was very interesting. Yeah. But other than that, I'm not too sure.
I had a question for Arielys. Is that how you say her name? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So when you interviewed the nonprofit organizations and things that you interviewed, I know you talked a little bit about like the integration process, and I was wondering if like they had like maybe like a plan or a path that could be adopted by different governments to help refugees integrate into different cultures and societies. And also, I really appreciated your German comparison. I'm taking German right now, and it is a very hard language. So that grammar's kind of crazy.
And just imagine someone who doesn't have that background at all, just trying to learn it. So in terms of the providers that I interviewed, so one of the things, I mean, obviously every country has their own issues, their own ways that they're going to integrate individuals, but definitely the education component is a big one, because when you have individuals who are getting more job readiness skills and having that language skills, that really allows them to adapt. And I think a lot of the countries overall internationally, that's something that they all tend to adapt, because they want refugees to acclimate to the culture. But one of the things that really struck with me when I interviewed one of the agencies, that they do a lot of the distribution. So it was with the Catholic bishops. They're one of the 9 national organizations in the United States who help with the distribution of funds. And the person I interviewed, she said, having more the flexibility instead of just having a strict standardization process of after the resettlement process, and being able to decide how they distribute funds much easier would really help, because every refugee family and individual has a different need. So if we have it so rigid, then they're not able to really help individuals as much. Okay. So in terms of that, I think having more flexibility and having the nations communicate is important, but having more flexibility is instead of just having a standard process that is key, and also having individuals really have a way to get touched through the refugee process. So whether that's volunteering in their community or doing something is really helpful, because it changes overall perception and then allows policymakers to be more willing to pass policies that admit individuals and allow them to perhaps provide more funding.
Any other questions for the presenters? Well, thank you. I think each and every one of you did a really interesting presentation, highlighting different impacts of our ever intermingling world and some of the challenges that it faces. So thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job, everyone. Thank you.